A spool of red gros grain ribbon sat in a child's purple backpack between a flashlight and a spelling test. The backpack rested on the floor of a tow truck whose 3 body panels were different shades of white. And the girl who owned it was 9 years old, sitting beside her father in the cab while a blizzard warning scrolled across the AM radio. His name was Russ Mercer, a roadside mechanic and widowed single father whose mother-in-law had just filed to take custody of the girl beside him. He didn't know that in 3 hours, a man who dismissed him at a gas station would be dead in a ditch, and his 2 5-year-old sons would be trapped in the wreck. And he definitely didn't know that the ribbon his daughter carried for a school recital would become the only visible road through a whiteout, followed by men who'd never met him. When the blizzard buries the mountain pass and Russ finds the wreck, he becomes the only person alive who can reach those children. Carry one. Drag one. Protect his own daughter. Miles through a whiteout, with a clock measured in the degrees leaving a 5-year-old's body. If you are drawn to quiet stories about ordinary people who become extraordinary the exact moment someone needs them most, stay with us. The diesel smell arrived before he did, the way a man's reputation sometimes precedes him through a door he has not yet opened. Russ Mercer stood in the school lobby for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the fluorescent light, and watched the parents nearest the entrance take a small, unconscious step away from the smell that clung to his coat and his boots, and the cuffs of his jeans. The floor was waxed, and his boots left gray marks on it. The way a thought you cannot finish leaves a shape you cannot name. He noticed the marks and did not try to wipe them away, because there was nothing to wipe them with, and because he had learned long ago that some things cannot be hidden no matter how hard you try. He found a seat in the back row. The last folding chair on the left. The one with the leg that did not sit quite flat on the floor. The parents around him wore clean coats and carried expensive equipment on straps around their necks. Equipment that cost more than his truck was worth. Though he had no way of knowing that and would not have compared them if he did. He sat. He waited. The recital began. Sadie was on stage in the 3rd row of children, standing between a girl in a blue dress and a boy whose bow tie was slightly crooked. And Russ saw the red grosgrain ribbons in her hair the way you see a thing you know you did badly, the way you see your own handwriting on a form you filled out in a hurry. He had watched a tutorial 9 times that morning, pausing it and rewinding it and watching the woman's fingers again. And still the bows came out uneven. The left one smaller than the right. The tails different lengths. The girl next to Sadie looked at the ribbons and laughed. A small laugh, the kind a child gives without cruelty, without understanding that the thing she finds funny is a thing someone tried very hard to do well. Sadie felt the ribbons, touched them, and did not take them out. Russ watched her sing, watched her know the words and know when to come in and when to be quiet, watched her not look at him because she was watching the music teacher the way a child should, and he saw that she did not touch the ribbons again. After the performance, the lobby filled with the sound of parents finding their children and the smell of coffee from a table near the doors. Russ stood near the exit, his hands in his coat pockets, waiting, letting the people flow around him the way water flows around a stone that has been in the river long enough to know its place. Lorraine was standing a few feet away speaking to a woman Russ did not recognize, a relative probably, and he heard her voice before he saw her face. "Is a good man," Lorraine said. "But a good man isn't always a dependable father." She said it the way a person states a fact she has checked. The way you say the temperature outside or the time of day. Without cruelty in her voice, but with certainty, and certainty was worse. Russ did not move, did not clear his throat, did not step forward to announce himself. He simply waited, the way a man waits when he has learned that there are conversations he is not meant to interrupt. And when Lorraine turned and saw him standing there, her face changed for half a second before she smoothed it again. He nodded at her. She nodded back. He took Sadie's hand and walked toward the door. The parking lot was cold. The way parking lots are cold in January when the sun has gone down and the wind has not decided where to go. Russ walked with Sadie toward the tow truck. The 3-tone white one with the mismatched panels that he had owned for 7 years and would own for 7 more if the transmission held. a car drove past them, a sedan with a clean wax job and a license plate from the county, and Russ heard the squeak, a high, thin complaint, from the front of the engine bay. The sound of a worn serpentine belt slipping on a pulley it could no longer grip. He filed it away the way a mechanic files away any sound he hears, without thinking, without deciding to. The way a person who has spent 20 years listening to engines cannot stop hearing what they say. He did not mention it, because there was no reason to. In the cab of the truck, the notice of herring envelope sat on the dashboard, propped against the windshield where the defroster could not reach it. The paper heavy and the seal on the back unbroken, though he had opened it twice already, once to read it, and once to make sure he had read it correctly the first time. "What's that?" Sadie asked, climbing onto the bench seat and pulling her purple backpack onto her lap. "Paperwork," Russ said. She did not ask again. She opened the backpack, and Russ watched her pull out the things she owned, one at a time, without hurry. A bag of pretzels she had packed because he forgot to eat lunch. A spelling test with a gold star at the top. A flashlight whose beam had been dimming for a month, and a spool of red grosgrain ribbon, the leftover from the morning, the ribbon he had cut from and tied and retied until his fingers ached. Russ looked at the ribbons in her hair, still uneven, still holding. "I can fix those when we get home," he said. "Make them even." Sadie touched the left ribbon, the smaller one, and then the right, considering the question the way a child considers a thing she has already decided about. "They're fine, Dad," she said. He put the truck in gear and pulled out of the parking lot, the headlights cutting a short, weak path into the dark. The AM radio was on, low, tuned to the station that gave the weather every 15 minutes, and the announcer's voice came through the static, calm and professional, reading the upgrade the way a man reads a warning he has read 100 times before. The winter weather advisory had been upgraded to a blizzard warning, effective immediately, with the Bighorn Mountains expected to receive up to 18 inches of snow, whiteout conditions, travel not recommended. Russ looked past the dashboard, past the envelope, past the windshield, toward the mountains that rose in the distance, and the sky over the peaks had already turned the color of wet concrete, and they were driving straight toward it. The gas station at the base of Route 14 sat under 4 buzzing overhead lights. Russ pulled the tow truck in beside a dark SUV, a newer model with paint clean enough to reflect the station lights, and he killed the engine and sat for a moment listening to the tick of the cooling metal and the sound of the wind picking up. Sadie was asleep against the passenger door, and Russ did not wake her. He sat in the quiet and watched the man at the fuel pump, a heavy-set man in a Carhartt jacket, stamping his boots against the cold while the nozzle clicked and the numbers turned. Then he heard it. A faint metallic knock, irregular, coming from the front driver's side wheel of the SUV. The sound of something not seated properly. Something that would work itself loose at speed and fail at the worst possible moment. Russ got out of the truck. The cold hit him like a wall as he walked across the lot toward the SUV, his hands out of his pockets. The man at the pump looked up. "Your tire chain," Russ said. "It's not seated right. The crosslink is riding the sidewall. If you take that up the mountain, it'll tear the brake line." The man looked at Russ the way a man looks at something he has already decided about. Rick Keeler looked at the tow truck's mismatched panels, then at Russ's stained jacket and cracked hands. "You should worry about keeping your own truck running," the man said. His name was Rick Keeler. Russ did not know his name then. He would learn it later, from the news reports, the same way everyone else learned it. Russ nodded, accepting the dismissal without argument, and walked back to the tow truck. Sadie was awake when he opened the door. "Who was that?" she asked. "Nobody," Russ said. He put the key in the ignition and turned it, and the engine caught on the second crank, the way it always did when it was cold. They pulled out of the station and onto the highway. The sky was the color of wet concrete, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall. "Why wouldn't he listen?" Sadie asked. Russ considered the question the way he considered any question from his daughter, with the full weight of a man who knows that the answers he gives now will be the answers she carries. "People usually see what they have already decided to see," he said. Sadie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you see when you look at me?" Russ did not answer right away. Keeping his eyes on the road where snow had begun to accumulate, he thought about the uneven ribbons in her hair, the spelling test with the gold star, and the pretzels she had packed because he always forgot to eat. "Everything," he said. The snow came harder. Within 10 minutes, the flakes were coming sideways, driven by a wind that had not been there when they left the station. Within 20, the road had disappeared entirely. The white line and the shoulder and the guardrail all erased, replaced by a single, featureless surface that moved under the headlights like a river. Russ slowed the truck to 5 miles per hour, the defroster struggling to keep a clear patch on the glass. The AM radio had gone to static. Having driven this route 100 times in every condition, he knew the western slope and the curve before the summit where the county salt storage shed sat. It was the closest, safe structure, and he knew he could reach it if he could keep the truck moving. The tree came down without warning. A wind-loaded ponderosa pine snapped from the frozen earth, 40 yards ahead. A wall of trunk and branches filling the headlights falling fast. Russ jerked the wheel. A hard, violent pull. But the truck was heavy and the road was ice. The tires locked. The chassis slid. The right wheels dropped off the edge. There was no road. Only a rock culvert hidden beneath the drift. The truck plunged into it. The frame slammed against stone with a deafening crack. Metal sheared. The cab pitched violently sideways. Above them, the pine crushed the bed, the massive trunk shattering the rear window. Tempered glass exploded into the cab. Beneath them, the undercarriage tore open. The sharp, toxic stench of ruptured gasoline flooded the floorboards instantly. Then came the wind. It shrieked through the shattered window, turning the cab into a wind tunnel, stripping the heat away in seconds. Sadie was in his arms. He did not remember reaching for her, but she was there, her face pressed into his chest, her backpack between them, her small hands gripping his coat. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. He looked around the cab. A single beam pointed at nothing from the floorboards. The guardianship envelope from the dashboard was gone, carried away by the wind, and the truck's engine was dead. He assessed the situation the way he assessed any situation, by starting with what he could not change and working down to what he could. Staying was impossible. The wind would strip their body heat in minutes. The fuel leak posed an immediate threat, and the tree's weight was still shifting against the crushed roof. He would not stay. "Listen to me," he said, his voice calm. "We're going to walk west. There's a shed. I know where it is." Reaching behind the seat, he pulled out the wool moving blanket, the emergency foil blanket, ratchet tie-downs, his seatbelt cutter, and the flashlight with the weak but steady beam. He handed the flashlight to Sadie. "I need you to put this inside your coat," he said. "Against your chest, under your thermal layer. Your body heat will keep the battery alive. You only pull it out when we need it. Do you understand?" She tucked the flashlight into her coat against her ribs. She shouldered her purple backpack. They stepped out of the truck and into the whiteout, the wind hitting them the way the wind hits anything small and exposed, and Russ took her hand and turned west, and they walked. Behind them, the snow filled the cab of the truck, covering the seats, covering the broken glass, covering everything. The wind erased their tracks as they made them, and within a minute there was no sign that anyone had ever been there at all. They walked west into the whiteout, and Russ kept Sadie's hand in his the way a man keeps hold of something he has already lost once and will not lose again. The snow erased their tracks as they made them, and there was no road beneath their feet. Only the slope of the shoulder and the memory of the guardrail somewhere to their right. The dark shape emerged from the whiteout, a mass of metal and glass that had no business being where it was. An SUV, dark-colored, resting against a ponderosa pine on the slope below the guardrail, the tree holding it in place against the steep grade. Russ stopped walking. He pulled Sadie behind him, his body between her and the wreck. The guardrail was bent outward where the vehicle had punched through, and the slope below was steep enough that the tree was the only thing that had stopped the descent. The front end was crumpled against the trunk, The windshield starred in a pattern that meant a head had hit it. He descended the slope slowly, testing each step, and when he reached the driver's side door, he saw that the window was gone, and the airbag had deployed and deflated. And Rick Keeler was sitting in the driver's seat with his head at an angle. That meant he was dead. He had been a man who talked too much and listened too little, but he was dead now. The way a man dies when he is driving too fast in conditions he does not understand, and the road runs out before he does. Russ reached through the broken window and felt for a pulse at the side of Rick's neck, checking something he already knew the answer to, and there was nothing. The skin was cold, the body already cooling in the wind. He turned his attention to the back seat. The twins were there, strapped into their car seats. Seth was crying, the kind of crying that comes from shock and cold, his small face red and wet. Luke was not crying. Luke was staring straight ahead, his eyes open, his body still, the look of a child who has gone somewhere inside himself that the cold cannot reach. Russ felt something shift in his chest, but he did not let it break. He had work to do. He checked the vehicle stability. The tree was holding it, the trunk thick and solid, the frame driven into the bark. He wedged debris and packed snow beneath the low side and looped a short tow strap around the nearest tree trunk, a rough safety measure that would hold if the vehicle tried to shift. The rear window was gone, the frame lined with jagged fragments of tempered glass. He cleared them carefully, working the fragments loose with his gloved hands, creating an opening. But the opening was too small. He was too broad in the shoulders to fit through. "You have to trust me enough to help," Sadie said. She was standing behind him, her voice quiet and steady, the way a child's voice is steady when she has decided to be brave whether she feels brave or not. She had pulled the flashlight from inside her coat and was holding it in her right hand. The beam pointed at the ground. Russ looked at her. She was 9 years old, small enough to fit through the gap. She was trembling. He could see it in the way she held her shoulders, but she was asking him to let her help anyway. He had spent her entire life protecting her from things like this, keeping her away from the hard parts, treating her capability as something to shield rather than something to use. He looked at the gap in the window, and he looked at his daughter, and he nodded. "Okay," he said. She crawled through the gap, her body moving carefully, the flashlight casting shadows across the seats. She reached the back seat and positioned herself between the two car seats. Seth was in the seat closest to her. She reached for his buckle, pressed the red button, and the harness released normally. The boy's crying stopped, replaced by the kind of breath that comes after a long cry, uneven and wet. "Good," Russ said. "Now Luke." She turned to the quieter twin. She pressed the red button on his buckle, and nothing happened. The car seat frame had deformed in the impact. The structural plastic warped in a way that had locked the mechanism. Russ reached into his coat and pulled out the seatbelt cutter, the small tool with a recessed blade that he had carried for years and never used. He handed it to her through the gap. "See the webbing where it's tight against the buckle," he said. "Hook the cutter over it right at the tension point and pull straight." She took the tool in her hand, handling something she had never used before, but understood by instinct. She positioned it over the webbing, the recessed blade against the tension strap, and she pulled cleanly. The webbing parted with a sound that was almost silent, a whisper of fibers separating, and Luke's harness fell open. Sadie caught him before he could slide forward. She held him against her, an older child holding a younger one when there was no one else to do it. Russ pulled the cargo tub from the SUV's trunk, a heavy-duty aftermarket liner, rigid plastic. He flipped it smooth side down onto the snow, then threaded a ratchet strap through the existing drain holes set back from the front edge. The strap looped around his hips, and when he pulled, the upward angle of force lifted the front lip clear of the snow surface. He lifted Seth onto his back. The boy was light, lighter than he should have been, and Russ wrapped the wool blanket around him first, then layered the foil emergency blanket over the top, the reflective surface facing outward to shed the snow and block the wind. Luke went onto the cargo tub, wrapped in a waterproof jacket that Russ pulled from the SUV, his small body fitting into the plastic shell. Russ took stock of what they had. 4 people, 2 who could walk, 2 who could not. 1 flashlight tucked against a 9-year-old's chest, One spool of ribbon, one piece of plastic tied to a strap, and miles of whiteout between them and the shelter. He tightened the strap around his hips, and they started walking. The rhythm established itself the way a machine finds its operating speed, not chosen, not adjusted, simply the rate at which the load could be moved and the body could keep moving it. Seth was strapped to Russ's back, the wool blanket wrapped around him first, then the foil emergency blanket over that, the reflective surface facing outward to shed the snow and block the wind. Luke lay on the cargo tub, dragged behind on the ratchet strap looped around Russ's hips, the plastic shell sliding over the snow with a sound like a heavy drawer closing. Sadie walked alongside, tethered to his belt by a ratchet strap, one end clipped to her coat, the other end held in his left hand, the connection between them a length of nylon webbing that would pull her forward as she slowed and stop her from drifting. If the whiteout swallowed the distance between them, the exertion of pulling was immense, and Russ leaned forward into the strap, his hips taking the weight of the cargo tub, his back carrying Seth, his torso twisting with every step to keep the load balanced against the wind. The cheap metal zipper on his jacket could not take the mechanical stress, and it burst open from the bottom, the teeth separating one by one in a small surrender of metal to force that he felt more than heard. He reached for it, tried to pull the halves together, but the track was broken and the slider was useless, and the wind found the opening immediately. A cold that touched his thermal shirt and the damp layer of sweat beneath it. Sadie began tying the ribbon markers within the first few minutes of the walk, pulling the spool from her coat pocket with the careful attention of someone who knows that a small object dropped in snow is gone forever. She tied the first strip to a snow pole at the roadside, a proper knot, the kind her father had shown her once, the kind that holds. She tied the second to a guardrail post, the red ribbon standing against the white as a signal stands against noise. She tied the third to a signpost, and the fourth to the same guardrail 20 feet further, and the fifth to a tree that had fallen against the wire. And with each knot, she was leaving a thread behind them, a trail that would hold even if the snow covered their tracks. "Start your engines," she called. And from behind Russ's shoulder, Seth made a faint sound, a small vroom that the wind took and scattered. Luke stirred on the cargo tub, a movement of his head, a shift of his hand. Sadie called again, "Left turn," and Russ leaned into it, and red light, and he stopped, and green light. And they moved again, the game working the way a game works when everyone agrees to pretend that it matters. After about 30 minutes, the fine motor control in Sadie's hands began to fail, her fingers stiff inside the gloves, the joints refusing to cooperate the way fingers refuse when the cold has been in them too long. She tried to tie a knot and the ribbon slipped through her grip, the ends refusing to meet in the way that makes a knot hold. She tried again and the same thing happened, and she did not complain about it, did not call out to her father, simply changed her method with the quiet pragmatism of a child who has learned that complaining does not fix anything. She wrapped the ribbon strips tightly and tied clumsy, oversized knots using her wrists and palms, occasionally using her teeth to pull the freezing fabric tight against the guardrails, knowing that friction alone would never hold against the wind, and she kept moving. The motorcycle game failed in the same slow way, not all at once, but piece by piece, the way a thing fails when the cold has been working on it for too long. Luke stopped responding first, his eyes closing, his lips taking on a color that Russ did not want to name. Seth's responses faded from a word to a whisper to a moan to nothing. The small vroom becoming a sound that the wind swallowed before it could reach anyone. Sadie shifted to tactile checks, squeezing their hands, rubbing their cheeks, shaking them gently, the kind of checking you do not because you expect a response, but because you need to know if they are still there. Russ's left boot's sole separated somewhere in the second hour, the front edge coming loose and flapping open with every step, packing snow inside the boot, a wet cold against his sock that he could feel even through the numbness that had settled into his feet. The wind found the burst zipper on his jacket and drove straight through to his thermal shirt, the moisture in the fabric turning from warmth to danger, the heat leaving his core the way water leaves a cracked vessel. His right shoulder began to fail under the weight of Seth and the frozen foil blanket, and he felt something tear in the rotator cuff, a sensation that was less pain than the knowledge that something inside his body had given way. He shifted Seth's weight, adjusted the strap, and kept walking. The final stretch was not measured in distance but in the narrowing of his vision, the whiteout contracting around him until he could see only a small circle of snow directly in front of his feet. The world reduced to the next step and the step after that. He heard Beth's voice, clear against the wind. The way a voice comes through when you have been alone too long and the cold has opened a door in your mind that should stay closed. She was saying something he could not quite hear, a word or a name, and he wanted to stop and listen, wanted to turn toward the sound. But he kept walking because stopping was not something he was allowed to do. He stepped on something that was not snow. A guardrail buried beneath the white, the metal hidden the way the road was hidden, the way everything was hidden in the storm. He went down hard, his body falling forward, Seth's weight driving him into the snow, the cargo tub sliding past him, the strap pulling at his hips, and he lay there with the cold against his face and the wind above him, and the weight of everything pressing down. He tried to stand, and his legs would not answer, and his shoulder would not take the weight. And the cold was in him now, deep and patient, the way cold waits for a person to stop moving. Sadie dropped beside him. Her gloves were soaked through, the fabric frozen stiff, and she held his face in her hands, the cold of her palms against his cheeks, and she looked at him the way you hold something you are not ready to lose. You said people see what they decide to see, she said. I see you, Dad. She held his face and she did not let go. I see you getting up. He got up. Sadie saw the salt storage shed first, a dark shape against the white, a break in the snow where a concrete block stood with a steel door facing the road. She led him the final distance, her hand on his arm, her voice calling directions that he followed without hearing, his body moving because she had told it to move, and it was still obeying her. At the steel door, he bypassed the rusted padlock entirely by hooking his heavy ratchet strap to the door handle and the base of a concrete bollard. He cranked the winch, the mechanical advantage multiplying his exhausted strength, until the oxidized padlock shackle snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Inside, the shed was dark and cold and still, the concrete floor a heat sink that would pull warmth from anything that touched it. Russ flipped the cargo tub upside down on the floor, a barrier between their bodies and the slab, and he positioned the three children against the interior wall, Seth and Luke and Sadie, and he wrapped himself around them, his body between them and the door, his back to the steel, his arms around the only things that mattered. The shelter did not create warmth, did not generate heat, did not promise survival. It only cut the wind and slowed the rate of heat loss, bought time the way a person buys time. When time is the only currency he has left. Sadie used her teeth to loop the last strip of red ribbon around both their wrists. The ribbon from her own hair, the one she had worn all day, the one that still carried the warmth of her body. She tied it the way you tie something when your hands are too stiff to knot, using her teeth to pull the ends tight. And she said, "So you cannot disappear." She placed the flashlight on a high concrete ledge inside the shed, angling it so the steady beam shone straight out through the ventilation grate. Then she stepped back and began to kick the metal door rhythmically with her heavy snow boots. The sound was hollow and deep, the sound of a child who refuses to stop trying, the heavy thud of rubber against steel, the sound of someone who will not let the dark have the last word. She kept kicking, and the wind kept blowing and the cold kept working, and the light cutting out of the vent into the storm was the only thing in the world that was moving. Von Keeler had been organizing the search since Rick failed to arrive. Route 14 was the only crossing that made sense, the only road connecting Rick's last known position to anything resembling shelter. And Von knew that road the way you know a road you have driven 1,000 times, every curve and grade and drainage ditch, every place a vehicle could leave the pavement, and every place it could not. His company held the DOT commercial recovery permits, authorizing his heavy wreckers to pass through road closure gates on Route 14. He led a convoy of 15 to 20 club members and 4x4 pickups behind his wrecker, the storm having reduced from peak intensity to allow 10 to 20 meters of visibility. They followed as Rucker past the barriers that said no entry, past the signs that said travel not advised, into the white silence that had taken his brother. They found Russ's tow truck first, cab crushed. Right side dropped into a rock culvert, fuel-stained snow and boot prints heading west. The tracks were already softened by the falling snow, but still visible, still readable, still telling the story of a man who had walked away from a wreck that should have killed him. They found Rick's SUV below the road. Vaughn saw his brother dead at the wheel. He felt something break inside his chest, but he did not stop. He began to read the scene forensically. The rear window was shattered and the blizzard had packed the interior of the SUV solid with drifted snow. Vaughn retrieved a shovel from his wrecker and dug furiously into the back seat, his gloved hands clearing the packed ice until he uncovered the empty car seats. The harnesses were cut cleanly, one buckle open, one webbing sliced by the hook-shaped cut of a seatbelt cutter. The cargo tub was missing from the trunk, and a tow strap was looped around a tree. Vaughn stood in the snow beside his brother's vehicle and spoke the words aloud, not to anyone in particular, not to the men who had gathered behind him, but to himself. Because saying it made it real. He is not walking out with 2 children. He is trying to move 4 people through the storm. They followed the ribbon trail west. The markers were intermittent, some tied, some tucked, some torn loose by wind. The spacing grew. The method degraded. They found blood on a reflector post, and the impression in the snow of a body that had fallen, stayed down, then risen. Over the deafening roar of the blizzard and the heavy idling of 15 diesel engines, hearing anything was impossible. But as Vaughn scanned the tree line, his eyes caught something else. A dim, steady beam of red light cutting straight through the whiteout from the ventilation grate of the county salt storage shed. It was a shape against the white, a promise against the dark. Vaughn opened the steel door. Inside, Russ was wrapped around 3 children, positioned between them and the draft. Seth was layered in wool and foil against Russ's chest. Luke lay on the cargo tub wrapped in an SUV jacket, his skin gray. A strip of red ribbon looped around his wrist, and Sadie's. She was barely conscious, holding the flashlight she had pulled from her shirt moments before. She looked up at Vaughn and she said, her voice carrying nothing louder than a fact, "They're still breathing." Vaughn looked at the girl, and he looked at the man who had wrapped himself around children who were not his own. And he said, "No one gets left behind." He carried Russ Mercer from the shelter. Russ woke 2 days later in a room that was warm and bright and quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed and the world is still catching its breath. He did not know where he was for the first few seconds, did not know how he had arrived, did not know anything except that he was alive and that being alive meant there were questions he needed to ask. "Where is Sadie?" he said. A nurse told him she was coming, told him his children were safe, told him things that he heard but did not fully process because the only thing that mattered was the door opening, the face of his daughter appearing in the frame. Sadie sat beside his bed the way she had sat beside him in the shelter. Close enough to touch, close enough to hold, close enough to prove that she was real. She told him about the search, about Von Keeler and the convoy of heavy trucks that had plowed through the drifts to reach them. Von Keeler was already sitting in the chair in the corner of the room when Russ woke. He did not speak for a long time. He sat the way a man sits when he has been waiting hours to deliver news he knows the other man needs to hear. "The boys are recovering in the pediatric wing," Vaughn said quietly. "They're going to be okay." He stood and walked to the foot of the bed. "They looked at your truck and saw junk. They looked at your clothes and saw failure. I know what you did for my sons." He knelt beside Sadie's chair, his big hands resting on his knees, his voice dropping so that only she could hear it. "We found them because you left us a road." Vaughn offered money. Russ refused. "You don't owe me money. Your sons are alive." Russ did not condemn Rick. He said not a word about the tire chain or the dismissal. His restraint was total. Lorraine arrived later that afternoon. She saw the physical toll on Russ's body, the severe frostbite, the torn shoulder, and she saw Sadie sitting steadfastly at his side. She listened in silence as Vaughn stood in the hallway and explained exactly what her son-in-law had done on the mountain. She stood at the foot of the bed and she said, "I saw late pickups. I saw an old truck. I saw unpaid bills. I didn't see this." She told him she was calling her lawyer on Monday to formally withdraw the custody petition. She asked what support Russ actually needed, not what the court said he should need, not what the paperwork said he was entitled to, but what he needed, the real thing, the thing that would let him keep being the father his children had always known him to be. Russ lay in the hospital bed, his body still recovering, his hands resting on the blanket, and he looked at the people who had gathered in his room, the people who had come to see him, the people who had seen what he had done and had chosen to recognize it. He did not say much, because he had never been a man who said much, but he looked at his daughter, and he looked at the red ribbon that still circled her wrist, and he held her hand the way you hold something when you have been given it back, and you are not going to let it go again. For 4 years, he had believed that being a dependable father meant hiding his fractures, proving his worth through a clean coat, a paid bill, or a perfectly tied ribbon. He understood now, listening to the steady rhythm of his daughter's breathing, that love was not about providing a flawless surface. It was about the weight you were willing to pull through the dark. Russ Mercer left the hospital and returned to the garage the way a man returns to something he thought he had lost. Slowly, carefully, with the understanding that it might not look the same as when he left it. The oil stains on the concrete were the same. The calendar on the wall was still open to the month of the storm. The tools waited on their hooks, and he picked one up, a wrench. The first thing his hand found, and he held it the way you hold something that has always been yours. Von Keeler came that afternoon with a folder of papers. He laid them on the workbench one by one, explaining each contract the way a man explains something he has already decided will happen. Fleet maintenance agreements from trucking companies, construction outfits, logistics firms. They needed a reliable roadside operator. Russ needed customers. That was not charity. That was business. Russ signed them one by one, the pen scratching against the paper, the sound of a future being written. The parts for the tow truck arrived over the following months. Engines and axles, transmissions and wiring harnesses, each piece coming from a different source. A different hand extended in a different direction. Russ directed the rebuild himself, his right shoulder still stiff and scarred from the surgery. He learned to wrench left-handed, working through the evenings, through the weekends, acknowledging the permanent physical cost of his actions. Seth Keeler came to the garage after school, handing him tools before he asked for them, doing the heavy lifting when Russ's arm failed him, learning the names of things the way a child learns a new language. Luke sat on an overturned bucket and asked about the engines, about the differences between a V8 and a straight 6, about the things that made machines work. The motorcycle game returned, but it had changed. When Seth said, "Start your engines," it was a signal for play, for the ordinary joy of being a child in a garage on a Saturday afternoon. Lorraine came to the garage one evening. She stood in the doorway, her hands in her coat pockets, her eyes moving across the space. She asked what Russ needed, not what the court said he should need, not what the paperwork said he was entitled to, but what he needed, the real thing, the thing that would let him keep being the father his children had always known him to be. Russ told her about the counseling he had started, about the meetings he attended twice a week, about the things he was learning to say out loud that he had carried alone for too long. He had spent 4 years believing that survival meant bearing the weight by himself, but he was learning that endurance is not isolation. Lorraine listened. Then she said, "I can pick them up after school. I can help with homework. I can be their grandmother, not their problem." 1 year later, the club gathered for the annual Red Ribbon Ride, a procession of trucks, and on the cleared roads, some motorcycles, all of them carrying red ribbons tied to mirrors and antennas and handlebars, all of them moving toward the county shelter, toward the place where 4 travelers had been found alive. A highway marker had been installed at the turnoff. It read, 4 travelers found alive here after the Black Ridge blizzard. Because someone stopped it. Russ drove the rebuilt tow truck, the one that carried the name Red Ribbon Roadside on the door. Beneath the name, a line of text quoted Sadie's words. It means no one traveling behind them should lose the road. Sadie sat in the passenger seat, the red flashlight resting on the dashboard, the one she had used to signal the convoy, the one that now carried an engraving on its side. Keep the Inganas running. The morning of the next recital, Russ tied ribbons in Sadie's hair. His fingers found the same rhythm they had found a year ago. The same careful movements, the same patient work. The bows were still uneven. They were still the work of a man who had never learned to make a ribbon lie flat, who had never needed to, who had always trusted that the imperfection would be enough. Sadie looked at herself in the mirror. She did not ask him to fix them. She said, her voice carrying nothing but certainty, "Leave them." They walked out together. Russ carried his tool bag, the weight of it familiar, against his shoulder. Sadie carried the red flashlight, its beam ready, its batteries fresh, its purpose unchanged. A red ribbon hung from the rearview mirror inside the rebuilt truck's cab, turning slowly in the warm air of the heater. It was the same kind of ribbon Russ had tied in Sadie's hair. The same shade of red. The same imperfect bow. The same love carried in a gesture that had never been precise and had never needed to be. The ribbon turned. The morning light caught it through the windshield. The engine idled. And they left together, toward whatever came next, toward whatever road waited, toward whatever needed fixing. The same imperfection, the same love. But now every uneven bow carried the weight of everything they had survived.